boy, we're getting into this idea again, aren't we? The idea that Lewis Hamilton isn't being treated fairly at Mercedes. But this time it's different. Since he's leaving the team, surely this is to be expected, right? Well, not if you're Toto Wolff, who is keen to put speculation to bed regarding what went down during the Monaco Grand Prix, when Lewis made a cynical and morose remark regarding qualifying, and how he doubts that he will out-qualify his teammate for the rest of the year. Which admittedly isn't unfounded, considering that currently, in the qualifying head-to-head, George does lead Lewis by a bit. In fact, by a lot. But the associated comment is odd, implying that George is getting preferential treatment. In this case, having the singular example of the upgraded front wing, which was working well since it brought George to within 1,000th of a second of 4th place man Lando Norris on the grid. Which is a darn sight better than what could be said at the beginning of the year when the team had practically lost hope and I thought they were going to write yet another letter to the fandom now. But the thing that really stirred the pot amongst the community and made speculation run rife, and kind of inspired this video, was that George was given the front wing ahead of Lewis and that Hamilton didn't get a say in the matter. That now George is getting the best bits first and Lewis has to wait his turn. Was this outright favoritism? And matters were not really helped when during the race Lewis Hamilton didn't really get the proper instruction to go all out on his outlap, trying to get the slip of a Max Verstappen, to actually see an overtake in the top 10, which we didn't get. Seriously, the top 10 did not change at all. But being Ocon's advocate, I would also say that Lewis probably should have had the idea of, giving it the beans or giving it some hammer time out of the pits to try and maybe get Max by the end of that lap. I mean, he is one of the most experienced drivers on the grid. You'd think that would have occurred to him. But my prevailing thought when I heard all of this go down was complete and utter frustration. Dude, just a few months ago you were lamenting about being used as a guinea pig in Mercedes experiments with the W15. You were sick and tired of that. You wanted to not waste time in finding setups, and then you did end up wasting time finding setups in China, which cost you potentially good results in the race after a really good sprint, which Toto did berate you for in front of everybody, which he wouldn't have done last year or the year before that or ever. And now you're going, oh, George got the part before me. No, they were doing you a service and not giving you an experimental part because you were sick and tired of being used as an experiment. And sure enough, that notion turned out to be right on the money, because further elaboration came out and has continued to come out over the next few days after the race that Lewis Hamilton was given the option to have the front wing for that weekend, but he chose not to. And George was the one that got it because he felt capable and up for giving it a go. Anything to try and get somewhere in Monaco. Even when George offered to settle it over a coin toss to be as fair as possible, letting fate decide. But Lewis tried it out in the simulator supposedly and thought better of it. And the fact that Lewis even got in a simulator, him being one of the biggest advocates against simulator work, that's a pretty big deal in of itself. And it's not the first time there has been this disconnect between the two drivers this year, where one driver says one thing and then the other disputes it, such as when Hamilton said setup choices earlier in the year were different, and yet Russell said they weren't and they were actually pretty similar. And you know what? This sort of rhetoric is just making me want to shut down about the whole thing. Who's right? Is Lewis in the right or is George in the right? In fact, now I don't believe either of them. I can't really make a decision. Who is in the right here? I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. This sort of thing, where one driver's going against the other driver, and then they're bickering, and then Toto has to be the mediator and calm everything down, saying, now George, now do we stop fighting? We are supposed to be finding out what can happen with Mercedes and getting us back on top of the grid. You should not be contradicting one another and even me. So with due respect, Lewis, shut your pumpkin nickel hole. So I went to Twitter and asked you this question, and even though it was clear that the public doesn't see Lewis being favoured, there is nearly a 60-40 split in favour of Russell being favoured instead of neither of them, with specific replies confirming this with the notion that it's only right that George be preferred since he isn't the one leaving the team, and it's the best bet if the team want to better understand the W15 and then enter the W16 for the following year. And to me, this naturally checks out. This seems to be the case with every single team up the grid when they got one driver staying and the other departing. Yes, his contract is up the following year, But bar a wild Max Verstappen homing into view between Toto's sheets, I seriously doubt that changing, and that George is pretty much there for as long as he wants to be. They'll want to develop the car around him to maximise its potential for next year, since he's going to be the lead driver, and now it's going to be up to Lewis this year to adapt to this change gradually. Even though this car was originally meant to be geared toward Lewis, since one of the biggest criticisms he had last year was because his feedback wasn't being really taken seriously with the W14, and only after a few races was it being so, and that the following year's car, this year's car, would be even more geared toward Lewis, with his feedback taken more seriously than ever, him dedicating more time in the simulator, which again is a huge big deal considering how much he hates the simulator. And after all of that, George is still better. I don't know what this says about Lewis. I mean, it could easily say that maybe Mercedes' correlation and feedback cannot be trusted, and that what they produced was not good enough for Lewis, or simply put, it's just Lewis is not really in the right frame of mind. That he's basically checked out, and even though he does say things like, oh, we're all pushing together as a team and we look to improve things, that's pretty much what every single driver says. And there have been many instances and many interviews where he just looks like he's there, he's participating, he's doing what he's contractually obliged to do. And I don't blame him entirely, because, you know, going to Ferrari next year, that's a pretty big deal. That is very exciting, and you kind of want to get things over with. I mean, the media seems to want that to happen. Everyone can't wait for Melbourne next year, especially since Melbourne is the season opener again after a very, very long time of it not being so. And then this comment got me really thinking, could Mercedes be bitter toward Lewis and are thusly accelerating the isolation of said driver? I mean, sure, Lewis leaving the team after a decade would come with some very strong emotions attached to it, but again, I think this is part and parcel of when a driver leaves. It's typical. It's traditional. And it's not like things broke down severely and that there was no talk of a contract extension whatsoever. There was. Lewis wanted to stay with the team ideally, but the demands that he proposed to the Mercedes board were not good enough, or were not what they were looking for. And what they did offer back was not what Lewis was looking for. There was just not a meeting of minds, and thusly the talks broke down. Sure, it's unfortunate, but that's how contract negotiations work. If it doesn't work out for both parties, you give up, you pack up your suitcases, you go home, and then go and find another driver. And then naturally Ferrari gets wind of this. John Elkann throws tons of money in his direction and basically gives him whatever he wants to come over. And then naturally Lewis Hamilton is going to take that with open arms, since this means that he is set for life basically, and all the philanthropic ventures that he has made over the years regarding different circumstances and genres and mediums, they're going to be funded for all of eternity. And in some cases that can easily be a good thing for people who are participating in it. Whatever happens during his tenure as a Ferrari race driver, all the other stuff, and Lewis himself, oh, he's golden. At the same time though, Mercedes has a duty to ensure that both drivers are able to function as drivers with little hesitation. Or as some might say, paranoia? Well, that's an interesting thought mooted by the race. Is Lewis Hamilton paranoid that Mercedes is not giving him what he wants? Well, like I said earlier, no, he's not. He could have had the brand new front wing, but he relinquished that right, and instead put the onus on not breaking said part on his younger compatriot, who used it to good effect. And besides, it's not like he is going to be getting that front wing only for the rest of the season. Lewis is going to be getting that same front wing for the Canadian Grand Prix. And that's one of his favourite tracks. That's the place where he got his first ever F1 victory. Lewis loves the Circuit de Gilles Villeneuve, and having the latest and greatest Mercedes parts might yield a really good result. He might be in the top 5. It might be his best result so far this season. And so far he has been steadily improving, so this might be a good boost of morale after Monaco not being so much and it being quite shaky. And this kind of stuff, when a team only has one component to try on one car, it happens. What do you think McLaren have been doing the last couple of years? Lando's usually the one to get the full set of components. Oscar either has to make up with not having the parts or only having half of the parts, and then Oscar gets those parts for the following race. They want to try and rush it forward to get the most out of it as possible, and Lando is the de facto team leader and has a lot more data behind him in terms of correlation and the wind tunnel than they do on Oscar. So it makes sense to try it out on Lando first entirely and then go from there. And I doubt that Piastri sees this as paranoia. I bet he just sees this as a standard procedure, and he's going to get the parts for the next race anyway. It's only one Grand Prix. So why should Lewis feel that same way? He was given the opportunity to have that part and he chose not to. But still, do I really believe that though? I don't know. That's the thing. I'm just completely and utterly confused. Who is in the right? But whoever is right, that front wing had just been made, and there was no time to get 2 iterations of it and a spare ready for Monaco, or else they would have had to delay it entirely and move on to Canada. And if you've got a part that could significantly improve things and is looking good in the wind tunnel and could make all the difference on Saturday at the Monaco Grand Prix, then you get that to that track, even if it's only just one copy of it. One driver could benefit from it, and then you can learn from it, and then the second driver might get a little bit more data on how to optimize it. But then I step back and think, this is something I've been considering for the last few races. In fact, ever since that announcement got made, because Lewis, this experience is completely alien to him. He's never had an exit strategy of this magnitude before in his F1 career, or even in his entire motorsport career. Yes, he's exited an F1 team before when he departed McLaren, but that came about near the end of the 2012 season, and so thusly, there was little time to get embroiled in awkward tension or lengthy departures. He had a few races left to go, he had some fun, he had his moments, but he could quickly just eschew all of that, leave Woking, go to Brackley, and then look forward to his time at Mercedes, which did yield a pretty good result. There wasn't really much time to get really bogged down in the idea of leaving, because you were fed up of being at McLaren, you wanted to try somewhere else, and Niki Lauda and Mercedes gave you that opportunity. You were more excited than sad to be cut out of meetings. This though, the departure from Mercedes, this is a far more protracted farewell tour. Whoever chose to drop this news of Lewis Hamilton leaving, probably a lot earlier than Ferrari would have wanted, was probably not an ally of Lewis's, and all it's done is just cause a lot of headaches for both he and Ferrari, because questions throughout every single Grand Prix tends to just focus itself around the idea of, Lewis, are you looking forward to going to Ferrari? Or Ferrari, are you looking forward to having Lewis around? Charles, are you looking forward to having Lewis as a teammate? There are so many other things to talk about in a race weekend. Ferrari are getting sick and tired of it. Lewis is getting sick and tired of it. They're probably not going to be answering those questions anymore. And in fact, in previous videos, I've shown you that they are getting sick and tired of it and they don't answer them anymore. But the point is though, is that whenever a driver leaves any team, there is going to be a time when they are going to be cut out of certain meetings because they do not apply to them anymore. That being what's going to be happening next year, and the ultimate development of the W15 and what could be taken on for the following season. And even if it's part and parcel of a typical driver's career in Formula 1, it's still pretty galling for Lewis because it's not something he's used to. He's used to having carte blanche everywhere at Mercedes. Everybody knows his name. He could practically go around every single place in the factory. Now though, that's slowly being curtailed and restricted. And that's a really big cultural shock. In fact, you could easily say it's quite distressing. Maybe he should ask some advice from Fernando because he tends to change teams all the time. He doesn't care. And as for Toto, he's probably equally as baffled as to how to handle all of this. How is he going to handle the transition of Lewis not being there anymore? Because he would have wanted Lewis to stay at the team, but the board said otherwise, and therefore it was out of his hands. He would rather things just stay the way they are, but they're not going to. And he does not have that much experience when it comes to these sort of thing, especially when he's been at Mercedes. Because the only 2 drivers that had departed under his tenure were Nico Rosberg, who chose to retire out of the blue, surprising everybody, so there was no extra strategy with that one, or at least not a traditional one. And then there was Valtteri Bottas. Okay, yes, Toto did have a lot of control in that one, but that was because he was the architect of that entire maneuver, working with his close friend Fred Vasseur, who was the team principal of Alfa Romeo at the time, to make sure that, thanks to all of the hard work that Bottas had undertook for Mercedes, at great sacrifice for Valtteri, it made sure that he had a team to go to where he could be the team leader and also not have to rely on single-year contract handouts. Instead, he can now have a multi-year deal, the first that Valtteri had had in several years. Suffice to say, this is a very dragged-out mess, which is spilling out into almost every other weekend, with Toto having to make statement after statement commenting on how both drivers are equal, and that the last time team orders were a major factor of a decision taken by the pit wall was the last race of 2016 when Rosberg took the title. I would beg to differ on that front, Toto. For starters, does anybody remember the whole Valtteri it's James thing? and how situations where Valtteri was doing something and then he would have to not do that anymore or have to do something else or give a place to Lewis and all that stuff. Yeah, that's dictating the race, even if it's just for one Grand Prix and not a title hunt. And then, of course, there's last year's Brazilian Grand Prix, where George was looking a damn sight quicker than Lewis, but was told to hold station, not to take any risks. And that was one of the worst races of that season for Mercedes, and it did rankle George's hackles up a bit. You can understand why George would be frustrated, because at that moment, he had an opportunity to try and do something. And let's also be real here, George is quite impulsive to the point of annoyance when he has an idea and he wants to try it out. Sometimes those ideas do work, but most of the time they don't. But that'll improve over time. Now that he is in a leadership role, they might take him more seriously, but at that time, it did cause some friction, especially at the track where he got his first Grand Prix win the year before. That is until Max Verstappen potentially shows up next year and completely wipes the floor with him and says that he's the team leader now. Or maybe Kimi Antonelli comes in and shows up George Russell, him being the future of Mercedes. And then eventually George leaves, and then that leaves Verstappen and Antonelli. And then who do you want to train up your version of Max Verstappen? Well, the Max Verstappen. Regardless of that speculation, Mercedes are looking like they are slowly starting to understand what the W15 is all about. And sure enough, as I predicted, it's right when they get to the Canadian Grand Prix. Sure, they're not in contention for wins or even podiums right now, but they are certainly getting a little bit closer to the top 3 teams. It's not that insurmountable. They are only maybe about 3 or 4 tenths a second per lap in terms of race trim behind McLaren and Ferrari. If they have a couple of good upgrades, which they can really catch up on since it's a brand new concept, and something that is going against the grain of what the other 3 teams are doing, they could pull a couple of surprises. I mean, they did have the cannons from the W14 that Red Bull had brought over to some good effect, so they might have been onto something, so you never know. And that front wing of theirs has turned many heads, so if they can continue to develop that, and therefore it can actually be the fundamental part as to how air flows over the car, and if it can work well, then they might be onto a winner, if not with the 15, then with the W16. Or perhaps, better yet, we might get a season finally where we have more than 3 teams in contention for a Grand Prix victory, which can only be good. As for Lewis's discourse and contradictory comments which scratches many heads up and down the grid and online, I reckon it's a mixture of frustration, sadness and acceptance. Frustration because all of the input that he had dedicated to the W15 throughout the entire winter and the end of last year has not produced the results that he was expecting, and has also yielded the worst start to a season he's ever had, as by his own admission. He hoped that that would turn the team around, and it simply hasn't. They are now in 4th place, and they've not been 4th place in the Constructors for a very long time. Sadness because he's not going to realise the dream of getting that next world title with Mercedes, the team that really gave him the platform to really excel post-McLaren. That would have been nice to get that last title with them, because I think that was what the intention was in 2021. He would get that 8th title, and he would have called it a day, and he would have gone on to go and pursue a music career and philanthropic efforts. And of course, walk the fashion catwalks. And there's an acceptance that this big chapter of his life that has been powered by Mercedes is now being finalised and then signed off, and then a new chapter is going to begin, however long it is, that he's going to be racing in red, driving for the Scuderia, something he's long talked about, and the team want him. They want him. He could realise something big there, and even if he doesn't get a world title with him, he gets to wear a red racing suit and potentially add more victories to his win tally that has remained static for almost 3 years. I think Lewis would be happy just to get that 104th win, almost as happy as Lando Norris was when he got his first win, because it would be a sign that Lewis hadn't lost it. He could still win Grand Prix victories. Yes, it would be in theory one of the best cars, but that's the case for any driver who has the best car. That's what happens. But him having that would validate his choice, that he made the right one, that he's now back in a team which is competitive, after being with a team that has fallen off. It showed some moments of competitiveness, but not a sustained effort. Well, then again, it might not. We don't know what's to come, but a lot of people want to find out, including Lewis. But the reality of right now is that when it comes to his transitional year from black to red, it's not exactly setting the world alight, and it's only raising questions he and Ferrari would rather not dignify with an answer. Lewis wants to end his time with Mercedes on a high, but he's being denied that. And in his mind, it's coming from a place where he's not the lead driver anymore, that George is being favoured over him. But That's natural for any departing driver. This is par for the course, something that Lewis is probably not used to, but it's something that he does have to get used to. Or he just has to adapt to the car, which is being geared more toward George again, after having been geared toward Lewis at the beginning. This is just something he has to accept if he wants to get anywhere. If he doesn't, we are going to see more and more of this develop over the season, and Toto has to play damage control for more and more races, and this might distract the team from getting anywhere if they want to get anywhere close to third place, and also keep Aston Martin far behind them. And then at that point, what else could he do? Except look toward Ferrari and see what they could offer him. And besides, I think we're all wishing for 2025 right now just to get Lewis out of his current funk, which is seemingly what is happening with Yuki Tsunoda, the red mist seemingly disappearing from his view. Find out why I think Yuki Tsunoda is onto a blinder of a season, and there's plenty more to come in this video here that you can go and watch right now.